Kentucky Route Zero begins with a man trying to finish a job. Conway is an aging truck driver making the last delivery for a failing antiques shop. The address is 5 Dogwood Drive. He does not know where it is, and the first person he asks tells him the only way to reach it is a road called the Zero. A highway that runs underground through the caves beneath Kentucky and does not appear on any map. That is the entire premise, and it is worth noticing how little it promises. There's no villain named, no stakes declared, no mystery posed as a question to be answered. A man has a package and an address. Everything strange that follows enters through an ordinary frame of a delivery that should have been simple. The game is a point-and-click adventure in 5 acts. There are no traditional puzzles. The player clicks to move and chooses dialogue. And the choices work unlike almost any other games. Dialogue choices generally do not alter the plot outcome. You decide what Conway says, or what he remembers, or how he feels, but not what happens to him. The road goes where the road goes. And this is the first thing the game establishes. Before any of its stranger machinery, you are here to travel and to witness, not to win. The Zero is not explained. The refusal is deliberate. It is an underground highway. Time on it does not behave. A sunset at the opening gas station never ends. And characters from different eras occupy the same spaces without comment. The travelers get lost, not because they take wrong turns, but because the road does not hold still. None of this is presented as a puzzle with a solution. It is the condition of the world. The people Conway meets accrete into a group, rather than a party in the game's sense. Shannon Marquez, a television repair technician, joins him early and stays. Others drift in and out. They are not recruited and they are not commanded. They are simply also on the road. And what the road runs on underneath its magical realist surface is money. The Zero and everything along it belongs directly or indirectly to the Consolidated Power Company, a corporate presence that owns the power lines, the pharmaceutical company, the distillery, and the bureau that processes what the region has lost. It is never a character, it is the water everyone swims in, and its instrument, the thing that holds people in place, is debt. The center of Kentucky Route Zero is an injury that becomes a bill. An injury to Conway's leg in a mine sends him to a doctor, and the treatment is what puts him in debt. The doctor, Truman, mentions in passing that he himself was lucky he took a scholarship from a pharmaceutical company. Strings attached, while less fortunate friends fell into irreversible debt. And the company, it turns out, is owned by Consolidated Power. The anesthetic that restores Conway's leg, Nuriprenol, leaves it glowing skeletal bone, an electrified limb that marks him as a debtor, owned by medical bills to that same company. Something has been taken from him that he cannot repay, and now he wears it. The debt compounds through the thing the region makes. Beneath a decaying church and graveyard sits the Hard Times Distillery, where the ghostly workers appear as skeletons, orange, buzzing, unable to speak except through tape reels slung around their shoulders. Debtors forced to labor until their debt is paid. There, in a mix-up, Conway is offered the company's top-shelf whiskey, ends up in debt to the company for both the whiskey and the tour. Unable to resist is the point, and the game has been building it. Conway is a recovering alcoholic. Across the act, Shannon works to keep him from relapsing. The system does not need to force the drink on him, it only needs to set the drink in front of a man it has already worn down and let his own history do the rest. He returns from the errand with a second glowing limb. The journey has cost him literally an arm and a leg. That is the whole argument of Kentucky Route Zero. Debt is rarely a clean choice. It is what happens when a system meets a person already carrying an injury, a history, and then it is theirs and it compounds. The developers have been unusually direct that this is the point. They have described the 2008 financial crisis and recession not as temporary embarrassments, but as fully consistent with post-industrial capitalism, and they have said the debt in the game is autobiographical, the ordinary kind, student loans, medical bills, confusing credit cards. This is rare enough to flag. Kentucky Route Zero's authors said plainly what the game is about. The politics are not a reading, they are stated. Kentucky Route Zero was built by people thinking about theater, and it shows in its bones. The art direction is drawn from theatrical set design, and the characters describe the player as a performer rather than a puzzle solver. Scenes are staged like a stage, figures lit against darkness, sets that rotate to reveal their own backstage. In the game's most celebrated sequence, the musicians Junebug and Johnny perform a song called Too Late to Love You. And as it plays, the roof of the bar lifts away. The night sky appears, and the player's role is to choose the opening line of each verse. You are not solving the song, but helping to perform it. This theatrical instinct becomes literal in the interludes, short, free pieces released between the acts, and canon accounts of this game tend to skip them, which is a mistake, because they are where the form declares itself. One, the quote-unquote entertainment, casts the player as a silent barfly watching a play staged inside the game, with access to the director's notes and the audience reviews. The game watches theater. The player watches the game watch theater. The nesting is the statement. The influences here are confirmed by the creators directly. They cite magical realism as an explicitly political tool. The use of the impossible to tell the truth about how the powerless are treated, naming both Salman Rushdie and Gabriel Garcia Marquez, whose 100 Years of Solitude Eliot describes trying to translate to Kentucky, and for whom the game's Marquez family is named. They cite Southern Gothic fiction, Faulkner, Flannery O'Connor, Tennessee Williams, and the Twin Peaks comparison every reviewer reaches for is one the creators own. They have named David Lynch as a direct influence on the game's tone and pacing. Here is the fact that makes Kentucky Route Zero unlike almost anything else, and it is not inside the game at all. The 5 acts were released across 7 years, Act 1 in January of 2013, and Act 5 in January of 2020. Players did not experience this game so much as wait for it, years between acts, long enough that a person could change substantially in the gap between 2 chapters of one story. It became part of the work's meaning, and critics who lived through it said it so directly. One described his reception of the game evolving across the wait from a well-written but fairly standard indie game into a novelistic accomplishment, and noticed that the change was partly in the game and partly in himself, in what he had become ready to see. A game about debt, precarity, and time wearing people down was delivered at the speed of an actual life, over an actual decade, into the actual recession it depicted. The developers framed the delays as mostly practical rather than deliberately symbolic, and that honesty should be preserved, but the effect is real regardless of intention. By the time the town at the end of the road appeared, its players had been following it for the better part of a decade. The game outlasted its own moment, and in doing so became about the passage it had accidentally enacted. The final act, which arrives at the address, and the man who was carrying the package is not there. Act 5 opens after a catastrophic flood in the town that contains 5 Dogwood Drive. Conway is absent and barely mentioned. Sometime in the previous act, drinking again and increasingly surrounded by the glowing skeletons, he left with them, or was taken. The game offers both phrasings and settles neither. The player now moves among townspeople who are rendered as shadowy ghosts that occasionally become solid. Resident digs a grave for 2 horses that drowned in the flood. The house at the address stands new and missing 2 walls. The travelers and the residents debate whether to leave or to stay and rebuild. The game ends with a burial and a gathering. The delivery in the ordinary sense is never completed. The man who set out to finish one job disappeared into the system that job ran on, and the story arrives at his destination without him, and does something else there instead. It buries the dead and asks the living whether to remain. What was a delivery became a funeral, and then became the question of whether a community rebuilds on the site of its own loss. The events of Kentucky Route Zero are stable and verifiable. A delivery, an injury, a debt, a transformation, a disappearance, a flood, a burial. Those happen, the game shows them, and unusually, the themes are verifiable too, because the authors stated them deliberately. Debt, labor, the recession, magical realism as political method, that much is on the record from the creators' own mouths. What the game withholds is its metaphysics, and it withholds them on purpose. The most important thing to say clearly: the game does not confirm that Conway dies. He left, and they took him, are offered as alternatives, and neither is resolved. The reading that Conway literally dies or becomes a ghost is the dominant fan interpretation, and it has hardened through repetition to something that gets stated as fact. But it is not fact. It is the single place where this game's audience has most confidently filled a silence that the authors deliberately left open. The same holds for the rest, whether the Zero is a literal road or a purgatory, whether the ghosts in the final town are the region's exploited dead, whether the flood is judgment or weather. Each is a reasonable reading, none is confirmed. The creators stated the politics and preserved the mystery. They told you what the game is about and refused to tell you what the game is. And that split is the whole character of the work. A game can name its subject and still decline to explain its world. Kentucky Route Zero does both at once, deliberately, and the discipline of writing about it honestly is holding those two things apart. The stated politics in one hand, and the withheld metaphysics in the other, and never letting the confidence of the first leak into the second. Kentucky Route Zero is one of the most acclaimed games of its era, and the record is unambiguous even where the scores are messy. Because it released as 5 separate acts, and then as a bundled console edition, there is no clean single aggregate score. A documentary should cite per-release figures rather than invent one number, but the awards are definite. It tied for the most nominations at the 2013 Independent Games Festival with 4: Excellence in Visual Art, Excellence in Narrative, Excellence in Audio, and the Seamus McNally Grand Prize, and 1 Excellence in Visual Art. It won Best Narrative at the Game Developers' Choice Awards in March of 2015 and the 2021 BAFTA Game Awards for Original Property as the bundled TV edition. Polygon ranked it 4th on its Best Games of the Decades list, and a month later called it the most important game of the decade, a verdict widely shared across the critical consensus of the period. Whatever a viewer concludes about its meaning, its standing is not in dispute. Kentucky Route Zero is a game about a delivery that is never delivered. Made by people who told you exactly what it meant and then it refused to tell you what it was. That combination is rare, and it is the thing worth carrying away. The temptation with a game this dense and this sad is to solve it, to decide that Conway died, that the zero is the afterlife, that the flood washed away the old world. The game invites those readings and rewards them and confirms none of them. It states its politics in daylight and keeps its metaphysics in the dark. And it does not consider that a contradiction. The road remains underground, the address is reached, and the man who sought it is gone. The debt is never paid, it is inherited, it is transferred, it is left running. And what Kentucky Route Zero says plainly is about money and about labor and the slow disappearance of people inside of a system. What it refuses to say, it refuses on purpose. And the refusal has held for years against every confident attempt to close it. The game told its players what it was about and let them argue forever about what happened. Both of those were choices. Both of them stand.